Reasons for Anarchy. Notes on Anarchism. Noam Chomsky. He is an American linguist, philosopher, political scientist, and activist, Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Reasons for Anarchy. Notes on Anarchism. In the 1890s, a French writer sympathetic to anarchism wrote that anarchism has broad and robust shoulders and, like cloth, is capable of supporting any burden, including that of certain militants who do more harm to the cause than they do. Your worst enemy. Qualified ideas and practices of. There have been many kinds of anarchists. It would be useless to try to fit all these divergent tendencies into the framework of a general ideology or theory. And even if we were to extract from the history of libertarian thought a living, ever-evolving tradition, as Daniel Guerin does in L'Anarchisme, it would be hard to formulate its doctrines as a specific and determinate theory of society and social change. The anarchist historian Rudolf Rocker, whose work offers a systematic analysis of the drift of anarchist thought towards Guerin-like anarcho-syndicalism, hits the nail on the head when he writes, "Anarchism is not a fixed, hermetic social system, but a manifest tendency in the historical evolution of humanity, which, unlike the intellectual tutelage exercised by ecclesiastical or governmental institutions, aspires to the free and expeditious development of all individual and social forces of man. Not even freedom is an absolute concept, it is only relative, since it tends to expand incessantly and to reach ever wider scopes in the most diverse ways. For the anarchist, freedom is not an abstract philosophical concept, but the concrete and fundamental possibility that each human being has to fully develop the faculties, capacities, and talents that nature grants him and put them at the service of society. The less ecclesiastical or political control interferes with this natural development of man, the more effective and harmonious the human personality will become, and the better it will show the intellectual culture of the society that has engendered it. One might ask, what interest can there be in the study of a manifest tendency in the historical evolution of humanity in which no concrete and detailed social theory finds expression? Indeed, many commentators dismiss anarchism as a utopian ideal, formless, primitive and, in any case, incompatible with the realities of a complex society. However, nothing prevents us from adopting a very different perspective and affirming that, at each stage of history, our purpose should be to eradicate those forms of original authority and oppression that, although they may have been justified at the time for reasons of security, survival, or economic development, currently exacerbate material and cultural misery instead of helping to alleviate it. From this point of view, there is no fixed doctrine of social change, valid for the present and the future, nor is there necessarily a concrete and unalterable idea of the goals towards which social change should tend. Our understanding of human nature and of the variety of viable forms of society is surely so rudimentary that any doctrine with universal claims should be viewed with the utmost skepticism, just as we should be wary whenever we hear that human nature or the imperatives of efficiency or the complexity of modern life require this or that form of oppression or autocracy. However, in each specific epoch we have every reason to develop, as far as our understanding allows, a specific realization of this manifest tendency in the historical evolution of humanity that is in accordance with the challenges of the present. For Rocker, the challenge that our time poses to us is to liberate man from the scourge of economic exploitation and political and social slavery, and the solution does not lie in conquest and the exercise of state power, nor in a brutalizing parliamentarism, but in the reconstruction of the economic life of the peoples from the base and in the spirit of socialism. But only the producers are qualified for this, since they are the only value-creating social class from which a new future can emerge. It is up to them to strip work of the shackles that economic exploitation has imposed on it, to liberate society from all the mechanisms and institutions of political power, and to pave the way for an alliance of free groups of men and women based on cooperative work, and in an administration in the interest of the community. To prepare the working masses of the city and the countryside for this great goal and to unite them in a militant force, such is the true purpose of modern anarcho-syndicalism, that is precisely its mission. As a socialist, Rocker takes it for granted that the authentic, definitive, and complete liberation of the workers is only possible under one condition, the appropriation of capital, that is, of the raw materials and the means of production, including the land, for part of the group of workers. As an anarcho-syndicalist, he also insists that in the pre-revolutionary period the workers' organizations generated not only the ideas, but also the reality of the future, embodying the structure of the future society, and hopefully awaits the arrival of the revolution that will abolish the state apparatus and expropriate the expropriators. In place of government, we proclaim industrial administration. The anarcho-syndicalists are convinced that the socialist economic order cannot be achieved by government decrees or statutes, but by virtue of the solidary collaboration between the minds and arms of the workers in each branch of production, that is, by elevating the management of all the factories to the workers themselves, so that the different groups, factories, and branches of industry become the independent members of the general economic organism that are systematically in charge of the production and distribution of property in the interest of the community, through freely adopted agreements. This was written by Rocker shortly after these ideas had been spectacularly put into practice in the Spanish Revolution. Just before that revolution broke out, the anarcho-syndicalist economist Diego Abad de Santillan had written, "In facing the problem of social transformation, the revolution cannot use the state as a means, but must rely on the organization of producers. We have based ourselves on this principle and we do not see that there is a need for a power superior to that of the unions to establish a new order of things. Someone explain to us what role, if any, the state can have in an economic organization in which private property has been abolished and there is no place for parasitism and arbitrary privilege. The suppression of the state requires force and vigor. It is the task of the revolution to put an end to the state. One of two: either the revolution delivers social wealth to the workers, in which case they will organize themselves with a view to collective distribution and the state will cease to have any meaning, or the revolution does not deliver social wealth to the producers, in which case the revolution will have been a fraud and the state will continue to exist. Our Federal Council of Economy is not a political power but an economic and administrative regulatory power. It receives its directives from below and operates according to the resolutions of the regional and national assemblies. It is a coordinating body, nothing more." In a letter from 1883, Engels strongly disagreed. Anarchists turn things upside down. They affirm that the proletarian revolution must begin by overthrowing the political organization of the state. But to do so at a time like this would be to destroy the only body that the victorious proletariat has at hand to impose the newly won authority, keep its capitalist adversaries at bay and to carry out that economic revolution of society without which its victory will inevitably end in a new defeat and a massacre of workers similar to that which put an end to the Paris Commune. For their part, the anarchists and, with singular eloquence, Bakunin warned of the dangers of a red bureaucracy, destined to become the most vile and despicable lie that our century has concocted. The anarcho-syndicalist Fernand Pelloutier wondered, is this transitory state to which we have to submit to necessarily be a collectivist prison? Why can't it be a free organization, limited only by the needs of production and consumption, stripped of any political institution? I do not claim to be able to answer these questions, but it seems clear that unless there is some kind of affirmative answer, the chances of a truly democratic revolution that puts into practice the humanist ideals of the left are slim. Martin Buber summed up the problem with the following image: no one can reasonably expect a sapling turned into a club to start putting out leaves. On the question of the conquest or destruction of state power lay the main disagreement between Bakunin and Marx. In one way or another, the problem has been raised repeatedly throughout the century that has elapsed since. From then, confronting libertarian and authoritarian socialists. Despite Bakunin's warnings about the red bureaucracy, which found their confirmation in Stalin's dictatorship, when interpreting the political struggles of 100 years ago it would be a gross mistake to make the demands of contemporary social movements depend on their historical origins. In particular, it is misleading to see Bolshevism as Marxism in practice. Much more accurate would be a criticism of Bolshevism by the left in light of the historical circumstances of the Russian Revolution. The labor movement of the anti-Bolshevik left opposed the Leninists because they did not take enough advantage of the Russian uprisings for strictly proletarian purposes. The Bolsheviks, prisoners of their entourage, used the international radical movement to meet specifically Russian needs, which soon became identified with those of the Bolshevik State Party. The bourgeois component of the Russian Revolution began to manifest itself in Bolshevism itself. Leninism became part of international social democracy, distinguishing itself from the latter only on strategic issues. In my opinion, if one guiding idea had to be extracted from the anarchist tradition, it should be the one enunciated by Bakunin when, speaking of the Paris Commune, he described himself in these terms. I am a passionate lover of freedom, and I believe that it is the only condition for the development and growth of intelligence, dignity, and happiness of man. I am not referring to that purely formal freedom granted, delimited, and regulated by the state, an eternal lie that, in practice, always translates into the privileges of a few thanks to the slavery of the rest, nor to that individualistic, selfish, petty, and fictitious freedom, proclaimed by the school of Juan Jacobo Rousseau and other schools of bourgeois liberalism that consider that the state, by defining the rights of each one, is the condition of possibility of the rights of everyone, an idea that leads inexorably to the reduction of everyone's rights to zero. No, I am referring to the only kind of freedom truly worthy of the name, the freedom that supposes the full development of the latent material, intellectual and moral faculties in each individual, the freedom that does not recognize more restrictions than those determined by the laws of our nature, restrictions that cannot properly be considered such, since the laws from which they derive have not been imposed on us by any external legislator, whether at or above us, but are immanent and inherent to us, and they constitute the very basis of our material, intellectual and moral being. These restrictions do not limit our freedom, rather, they are its real and immediate conditions. These ideas emerge from the Enlightenment, they have their roots in Rousseau's discourse on the origin of inequality among men, in the limits of the action of the state, by Humboldt, in the insistence of Kant, when defending the French Revolution, where freedom is the previous condition that allows acquiring the necessary maturity to be free and not the prize that is awarded after reaching said maturity. After the rise of industrial capitalism, a new and unexpected system of injustice, libertarian socialism is the one that has preserved and spread the radical humanist message of the Enlightenment and the classical liberal ideals, later perverted to support an ideology that supports the emerging social order. In fact, the same postulates that led classical liberalism to oppose state intervention in social life are those that make capitalist social relations equally intolerable to them. It is evident, for example, in Humboldt's The Limits of State Action, that he anticipated and perhaps inspired Mill, and to which we shall return later. This classic work of liberal thought, completed in 1792, is in its very essence, if prematurely, profoundly anti-capitalist. The ideas it exposes have to be pruned beyond recognition in order to transmute them into an ideology of industrial capitalism. Humboldt's vision of a society in which social ties are replaced by social bonds and work is done of one's own free will, recalls early Marx and his reflections on the alienation from work when it is something alien to the worker, and does not form part of his nature, when it does not lead to his personal fulfillment but rather to the denial of himself. To their physical exhaustion and mental degradation, the alienating work that relegates some workers to barbarian tasks and turns others into machines, thus depriving man of a connatural characteristic of his species, the conscious and free activity and the productive life. Similarly, Marx conceives of a new kind of human being who needs his fellow man. The workers' association thus becomes the true constructive impulse to create the social fabric of future human relations. It is true that classical libertarian thought, based on far-reaching premises about the human need for freedom, diversity, and free association, opposes state intervention in social life. But according to the same premises, the relations of production, wage labor, and competitiveness of capitalism, as well as its ideology of possessive individualism, must be judged profoundly contrary to the human being. Libertarian socialism can rightly be considered the true heir to the liberal ideals of the Enlightenment. Rudolf Rocker describes modern anarchism as the confluence of the two great currents that since the French Revolution have been acquiring their characteristic expression in the intellectual life of Europe, socialism and liberalism, and argues that classical liberal ideals ran aground in Europe. The reality of capitalist economic forms. Anarchism is necessarily anti-capitalist, since it opposes the exploitation of man by man. But he also rejects man's dominion over man. Rocker insists that socialism will be free or it won't be at all. In the recognition of this fact lies the profound and genuine justification for the existence of anarchism. From this point of view, anarchism could be seen as the libertarian wing of socialism. This is the approach that Daniel Guérin takes in studying anarchism in L'Anarchisme and other works. Guérin cites Adolf Fischer, who stated that every anarchist is a socialist, but not every socialist is necessarily an anarchist. Similarly, Bakunin, in his Anarchist Manifesto of 1865, laying the groundwork for his projected International Revolutionary Brotherhood, established the principle that its members must first of all be socialists. A consistent socialist must oppose private ownership of the means of production and the wage slavery that goes with it, as incompatible with the principle that work should be freely undertaken and remain under the control of the worker. As Marx said, socialists aspire to create a society in which work is not only a means of life, but the first vital necessity, an unattainable goal. When the worker submits to the authority of another or needs something more than his own drive, although some form of wage labor may be less hateful than another, none can remove the misery of wage labor itself. A consistent anarchist must oppose not only alienating labor but also the stultifying specialization of labor that occurs when the means of production. They mutilate the worker, turning him into a fragmentary man, they lower him to the category of a mere appendage of the machine, they make his work a torture that strips it of meaning, they take away the spiritual powers of work to the extent that it incorporates the science as an independent power. Marx did not see in this an inevitable phenomenon of industrialization, but rather a distinctive feature of the capitalist relations of production. The society of the future must take care to replace the current specialized worker, reduced to mere fragments of a human being, by the fully developed individual, suitable for the most diverse tasks, to whom the various social functions are but so many ways of giving free rein to his natural faculties. A prerequisite for this is the abolition of capital and wage labor as social categories, not to mention the industrial armies of workers' states or the many modern forms of totalitarianism or state capitalism. In principle, this degradation of man to a mere appendage of the machine, to a specialized production tool, could be overcome instead of being aggravated through the development and adequate use of technology, but this is something that cannot be achieved under the conditions of control. Autocratic production by those who make man an instrument at the service of their particular ends, disdaining their goals as an individual, to use Humboldt's expression. Even within capitalism, the anarcho-syndicalists aspired to create free associations of free workers that would engage in militant struggle and prepare to take over the organization of production in a democratic way. These associations were to act as practical schools of anarchism. If private ownership of the means of production is, in Proudhon's famous formulation, just another form of theft and exploitation of the weak by the strong, the control of production by a state bureaucracy, by benevolent whatever their intentions may be, it also does not contribute to creating the conditions under which manual or intellectual work can become the first vital necessity. Therefore, both systems must be overcome. By attacking ownership or bureaucratic control of the means of production, the anarchist aligns himself with those who fight to establish the third and final emancipatory phase of history. If the first turned slaves into serfs and the second made them wage workers, the third will abolish the proletariat in a definitive act of liberation that will put control of the economy in the hands of free and voluntary associations of producers. Fourier, 1848. Alexis de Tocqueville also warned in 1848 of the imminent danger for the civilization. While the right to property was the origin and foundation of so many other rights, it was easy to defend, or rather there was no need to defend it. At that time it constituted the citadel of the society, being the rest of rights the fortification that surrounded it, it did not have to repel any attack and, in practice, there was no serious attempt to storm it. But today, when the right to property is the last intact vestige of the aristocratic world, the only thing that remains of its citadel, the only privilege of a society that tends towards equality, things are very different. Just think about what the working classes feel, even if they remain silent. It is true that they are not as inflamed as before by political passion properly speaking, but do you not see that their passions, moving away from politics, are now social passions? Do you not see that, little by little, opinions and ideas are spreading among them that do not seek to abolish such a law, ministry, or government, but to dissolve the very foundations of society? In 1871, the workers of Paris broke their silence and proceeded to abolish property, the basis of all civilization. Yes, gentlemen, the Commune intended to abolish that class property which turns the labor of many into the wealth of a few. He aspired to the expropriation of the expropriators. He wanted to make individual property a reality by transforming the means of production, land, and capital, which today are above all means of subjugation and exploitation of work, into simple instruments of free and associated work. The Commune ended in a bloodbath, of course. The true nature of the civilization that the Paris workers had tried to abolish with their attack on the very foundations of society came to the fore again when the troops of the Versailles government recaptured the city of Paris. As Marx writes, with as much bitterness as right, the civilization and justice of the bourgeois order are displayed in all their sinister splendor wherever their slaves and their outcasts dare to rebel against their lords. In such moments, that civilization and that justice show themselves for what they really are, brazen savagery and lawless revenge. The virulent exploits of the soldiery reflect the innate spirit of that civilization, of which it is the avenging and mercenary arm. The bourgeoisie of the entire world, who gladly attended the massacre that put an end to the battle, shudders with horror at the profanation of brick and mortar. Ibid, pages 74, 77. Despite the violent destruction of the Commune, Bakunin wrote that the events in Paris ushered in a new era, that of the final and complete emancipation of the popular masses and their true future solidarity, above and despite the shackles of the state. The next international and solidarity revolution of the peoples will be the resurrection of Paris, a revolution that the world is still waiting for. Thus, the consistent anarchist must be a socialist, but in a particular way. Not only will it oppose alienating and specialized labor and aspire to the appropriation of capital by workers, but it will also insist that this appropriation be carried out directly, without the mediation of any elite acting in the name of the proletariat. In short, he will oppose the organization of production by the government, which is equivalent to state socialism, the authority of state officials over production, and the authority of managers, scientists, and managers in the factory. The goal of the working class is freedom from exploitation. It is a goal that cannot be achieved by replacing the bourgeoisie with a new ruling class. It can only be achieved by the workers themselves, taking ownership of production. The quote comes from 5 Theses on the Class Struggle by Anton Pannekoek, a leading figure on the Marxist left and one of the leading theoreticians of the Council movement. And it is that, in practice, radical Marxism converges with anarchist currents, as illustrated by the following characterization of the revolutionary socialism. The revolutionary socialist rules out that state property can lead to anything other than bureaucratic despotism. We have already seen why the state cannot exercise democratic control over industry. Democratic ownership and control of industry belongs only to the proletariat, which will elect industrial administrative committees from among its ranks. Socialism will be, in essence, an industrial system. Its electoral structure will be industrial in nature. In this way, those who carry out the community and industrial activities of the society will be directly represented in the local and central councils of administration, and the power of the delegates will emanate from those who carry out the work and they know the needs of the community. When the Central Administrative Industrial Committee meets, it will represent each sector of social activity. Thus, the capitalist state, political or geographical, will be replaced by the Industrial Administrative Committee of Socialism. The transition from one system to another will constitute the social revolution. Throughout history, the political state has been associated with the government of men exercised by the ruling classes. The Socialist Republic will be the government of industry, administered in the name of the community. The first entailed the economic and political subjugation of the majority, the second will bring economic freedom to all and will therefore be a true democracy. This programmatic statement comes from William Paul's The State, Its Origins and Function, published in 1917, shortly before Lenin's State and Revolution, perhaps his most libertarian work, appeared. Paul was a member of the Marxist-Leninist Socialist Labour Party, and later one of the founders of the British Communist Party. His critique of state socialism bears a certain similarity to the libertarian doctrine of the anarchists. Both start from the basis that state ownership and management degenerate into a bureaucratic despotism that the social revolution must replace with the industrial organization of society under the direct worker control. Many similar statements could be cited. The essential thing is that these ideas have already been put into practice in spontaneous revolutionary actions in Germany and Italy after the First World War or in Spain in 1936, and not only in rural areas, but also in industrial Barcelona. Arguably, the natural form of revolutionary socialism in an industrial society is some kind of council communism. It confirms the intuition that democracy is severely limited when the industrial system is controlled by an autocratic elite, be it owners, managers, and technocrats, be it a vanguard party or a state bureaucracy. In such conditions of authoritarian domination, the classic libertarian ideals developed extensively by Marx, Bakunin, and all true revolutionaries will be unrealizable. Man will not be free to fully develop his potential and the worker will continue to be a fragmentary man, degraded, a mere tool of a productive process directed from above. The expression spontaneous revolutionary action can be misleading. The anarcho-syndicalists, to say the least, took Bakunin's observation about workers' organizations, that in the run-up to the revolution, must create not only the ideas, but also the reality of the world very seriously. Future. The achievements of the Spanish Popular Revolution, in particular, were built on the patient work of many years of organization and education, on a long tradition of commitment and militancy. The resolutions of the Congress of Madrid, in June 1931, and the Congress of Zaragoza, in May 1936, prefigured in more than one sense the acts of the revolution, as well as other slightly different ideas outlined by Abbot de Santillan in his precise description of the socio-economic organization that would institute the revolution. The Spanish Revolution was relatively mature, both in the minds of libertarian thinkers and in popular consciousness. After Franco's coup, when the turmoil of early 1936 gave rise to the social revolution, the country had workers' organizations with the structure, experience, and knowledge necessary to undertake social reconstruction. In his introduction to the Anthology of Texts on Collectivization in Spain, the anarchist Agustin Souchy writes, "For many years, Spanish anarchists and syndicalists made social transformation their priority. In their trade union assemblies and in their newspapers, pamphlets, and books, the problem of social revolution was continually and systematically discussed. This is the work that hides behind the spontaneous achievements and the constructive work of the Spanish Revolution. The ideas of libertarian socialism, in the sense described, have remained buried in the industrial societies of the last 50 years. The two dominant ideologies have been state socialism and state capitalism, the latter, in the United States, increasingly militarized for obvious reasons. But for some time now there has been a revival of interest in anarchist ideas. The theses of Anton Pannekoek that I have quoted come from a recent pamphlet by a French radical labor group, Informations Correspondance Ouvrière. William Paul's words on revolutionary socialism are quoted in an article by Walter Kendall presented at the National Congress of Workers' Control in Sheffield in March 1969. In recent years, the workers' control movement has become a thriving political force in England, organizing numerous congresses, publishing a large number of pamphlets and attracting the support of the main unions in the country. The United Foundry and Engineering Union, for example, has adopted as official policy the program of nationalization of basic industries under workers' control at all levels. In continental Europe, progress is comparable. Of course, the events of May 1968 fueled the interest in council communism and other related ideas in France and Germany, as well as in England. Given the general conservatism of a society as ideological as ours, it is no surprise that these initiatives are conspicuous by their absence in the United States. But that too can change. The erosion of Cold War mythology at least allows these questions to be raised in fairly wide circles. If we manage to contain the current wave of repression and the left manages to overcome its suicidal impulses to build on the foundations that have been laid over the last decade, the organization of an industrial society according to truly democratic principles, subjecting work and the community to a control that is also democratic, will become the main topic of reflection for anyone who is sensitive to the problems of contemporary society. And as a mass movement in favor of libertarian socialism is generated, reflection will give way to action. In his manifesto of 1865, Bakunin predicted that an important element of the social revolution would be that intelligent and truly noble fraction of the youth who, despite belonging by birth to the privileged classes, will take up the cause of the people thanks to their generous convictions and ardent aspirations. Perhaps the student movement of the 60s can be considered a first step towards the fulfillment of his prophecy. Daniel Guerin has embarked on what he describes as a rehabilitation process of anarchism. He argues and, in my opinion, very convincingly that the fruitful ideas of anarchism have retained their vitality and, once revised and sifted, could help contemporary socialist thought to take a new direction and contribute to enriching Marxism. From those broad and robust backs of anarchism, he has chosen to carefully examine those ideas and actions that could be ascribed to libertarian socialism. It is something natural and opportune. Within this framework it accommodates both the great spokesmen of anarchism and the popular movements inspired by anarchist sentiments and ideals. Guerin deals not only with anarchist thought, but also with the spontaneous popular actions that, in the course of the revolutionary struggle, are what, in practice, create the new social forms. It deals equally with social and intellectual creativity. From the achievements of the past, Guerin also tries to draw lessons that can enrich the theory of social liberation. For those who, in addition to understanding the world, aspire to change it, there is no better way to approach the study of the history of anarchism. In L'Anarchisme, Guerin argues that 19th-century anarchism was primarily a doctrinal movement, while the 20th century has been for anarchists a period of revolutionary practice. His is an interpretation of anarchism that consciously points to the future. Arthur Rosenberg once noted that popular revolutions are characterized by their aspiration to replace a centralized or feudal government based on force by some kind of communal system that entails the destruction and dissolution of the old form of condition. This system will be either socialist or an extreme form of democracy, the premise of socialism, since it can only become a reality in a world in which the individual enjoys the greatest possible degree of freedom. It is, he adds, an ideal common to Marx and the anarchists. This natural struggle for liberation is contrary to the current trend towards the centralization of economic and political life. A century ago Marx wrote that the Paris bourgeoisie understood that there was no alternative but the commune or the empire, whatever name it might re-emerge under. In the economic aspect, the empire had ruined them by squandering public wealth, giving rise to enormous financial scams, supporting the artificially accelerated concentration of capital, which led to the expropriation of many of its members. He had suppressed them politically and exasperated them morally with his orgies. He had wounded their Voltaireanism by entrusting the education of their children to the frères ignorantins * and had inflamed their French nationalism by leading them into a war that could only offer compensation for the ruin it had caused, the fall of the empire. The wretched Second Empire was the only form of government possible at a time when the bourgeoisie had already lost the power to rule the nation and the working class had not yet acquired it. It would not be very difficult to reformulate the phrase to conform to the imperial systems of the 1970s. Freeing man from the scourge of economic exploitation and political and social slavery remains the fundamental task of our time. And as long as this is the case, the revolutionary doctrines and practices of libertarian socialism can inspire and guide us. Finish. Reasons for anarchy. Notes on anarchism. Noam Chomsky.